All right. Hello to everyone who has tuned in so far. I'm just going to give anybody else a minute or two to get logged in, and then we're going to get started on our lecture of flexibility versus mobility and how to improve both. All right. So I'm going to get chatting a little bit here. So thank you for everyone for joining in. This is a favorite lecture of mine to give due to it being a very popular topic amongst my patients, friends, and just about anybody who gets to ask me a question. So the big question is, how do I get more flexible? How do I get more mobile? Is there a difference between flexibility and mobility? And will they make a difference in my athletic performance or my injury reduction? And we'll touch on a bit of those topics right here today. So I want to start off with what the difference between flexibility and mobility is. So flexibility is essentially how far you can passively stretch a muscle or a joint, right? So really, I wouldn't even particularly get technical about what structure is getting in the way, because to the layperson, it's not going to make a tremendous difference. Like, yes, it will make a difference if you're getting a very, very hard end feel, like the end of your knuckle. You probably don't want to push into that too much. But you're going to need to be able to make ligaments, muscles, tendons, nerves, everything's going to need to be able to move particularly well to be very flexible. So your flexibility is how far you can passively. So if I take this hand and push this back further, that would be how flexible my wrist is. Mobility is how far you can actively move a muscle or joint. So if this is how far I can stretch it backwards, I can only get there, maybe a little more under my own power. So this requires a certain amount of strength. It does require a certain amount of flexibility, because if the tension of the tissues on this side of my wrist are too tight, I'm going to have a hard time moving particularly far, right? And it's also going to require stability of the adjacent body segments, right? So my elbow is going to have to be able to stay particularly still so that when I do that, I don't go out in this direction. And my shoulder is going to have to be stable so that I don't go to the outside too much, right? So it's not when I'm doing this, I'm getting a whole different motion. Really, I want to make sure my wrist is what's mobile, right? When we're talking about flexibility, you can pretty much yank on anything as hard as you desire, right? With mobility, if we want to isolate how well a joint can move under your own power, the other segments next to it have to be pretty stable. So I want to get into flexibility myths. And please don't shoot the messenger here. People tend to get a little bit upset with some of the things that I say, and that is a bit joking, but at the same time, people are tied to their flexibility. So in isolation, stretching only reduces your injury risk by about 4%, which is really not very much at all, especially considering that strength training reduces your injury risk by 69%, which is a decent chunk. That's above 2/3. So if you're stretching to try and avoid injuries, probably not the best use of your time. And it does take a decent chunk of time to stretch and stretch well. Things like a multiple exposure program. So maybe if you sprain your ankle and you get reintroduced to the activity that sprained your ankle in the first place, that was something that reduced injury risk by 38%. And then proprioception training, which is something that's working on maybe balance or how well you feel where your joints are or where your body is in space, that reduced injury risk by 45%. So these are much, much, much larger numbers than a 4% that was in isolated stretching. So another common myth would be that strength training makes you less flexible, which is really interesting because there was a study that found that resistance training improved flexibility as much as static stretching. And by static stretching, we mean something where take my wrist, pull it back, hold for a prolonged period of time. Maybe it's 10 seconds, 30 seconds, 1 minute, 5 minutes, so on and so forth. So I found it to be pretty interesting. And I mean, if you just take the words from the study at face value and say, okay, well, lifting any weights will make me more flexible, which is probably not entirely true. And that's saying that that would also be like stretching doesn't make you more flexible. No, it's just as much as resistance training. And I would argue that the resistance training would need to be through a full range of motion. So like, let's say you're doing a squat or a deadlift. You want to make sure you go all the way into a full hamstring stretch on your deadlift at the bottom, and then all the way up to the top. Maybe that's not what you're going to do with your maximum weight, but maybe with something loading you, I don't know, 50 to 70% of what you can tolerate, you want to do that. And that's going to help work on your mobility, how far you can move a weight through a full range of motion. Maybe if you're working on a squat, you work on the full depth, right? It's going to work on your knees, hips, low back. The ankles are going to have to move through a certain amount of range of motion as well. These are things that can help improve your active mobility, which is super important for you. So it's interesting to then find out that it improves your flexibility as well. So you kind of get a double benefit from these tasks. The next thing I would ask when it comes to flexibility myths is, are you truly inflexible? And this is one we see a lot in the clinic when, you get maybe a 13-year-old male athlete who says, I have inflexible hamstrings. Well, are they really inflexible? Are they truly short? Is it a muscle that couldn't ever get any longer, right? And the answer in not every case, but in most cases, is they're really truly pretty flexible. They don't have good mobility. That muscle is not good at relaxing and achieving its full range of motion. So true flexibility, right? A short muscle would mean that it has a reduced amount of what we call sarcomeres, right? That's basically like the cells of a muscle in layman's terms. You need more of them added in sequence to make the muscle longer. When it's shorter, it can't extend as much. When it's longer, it's a longer muscle. You'll have more flexibility. Unfortunately, in order to improve that and add sarcomeres, you need one of two conditions: a really gentle but super long stretch. We're talking hours over days, potentially over months, right? So when we have patients that do have that, we tend to put them in some type of device. There's a company called Dynasplint, and it's a very low tension spring that maybe their knee needs to become more flexible. It will very gently stretch them out. It's something we put on them overnight. The other alternative to that is what we would call eccentric strength training, which I could then argue that all strength training has an eccentric component to it, so it should improve some of that, improve your amount of sarcomeres, but at the same time, a heavy overload on the lengthening portion of an exercise. So if you're talking about bench press, it would be the lowering phase, a bicep curl, the lowering phase, squat, the lowering phase. But then on the other side, if you're doing maybe like a lat pull down and you want to improve your shoulder flexibility, maybe take a one handle, you pull it down with two arms, and then you get an overload on the one arm going up to get a stretch at that end range, and then come back down with two arms. These are just a couple ideas that you might try to apply to try and truly lengthen a truly short muscle, not just one that has what we're about to talk about now, increased tone. So increased tone would be a muscle that's turned on and isn't particularly great at relaxing, right? And this can be due to a number of reasons. Rather often, it's either a protective response to something painful, or protecting you from the end range of a muscle stretch is not comfortable, right? Your body doesn't love to sit at its end range stretch. Like, try stretching while you're sleeping. Your body won't even be able to go to sleep. Another thing would be stability, right? If you need to bend over and touch your toes, if you don't have particularly good back muscle strength, your hamstrings might not want to lengthen out, and they might guard you from weak back muscles or maybe weak core muscles. Same thing with hip flexors, right? If your lower abdominals aren't particularly strong, your hip flexors might compensate for some of that weakness and not want to relax and lengthen out. They might not need to be stretched. If you tried to stretch a contracted bicep and someone was pulling out on my bicep right now, they'd probably have a very challenging time lengthening it out because the muscle will not relax. So for someone who needs a muscle to relax, the end goal would be to get into strengthening the surrounding area, maybe even that muscle itself, to teach it to contract and relax, as well as provide stability to the area so that movement is stronger overall. Another, in the short term, way you can do that might be foam rolling, massaging, a heat pack, relaxation techniques. Sometimes even contracting and relaxing the muscle can really help a lot. Or another weird one is short-term stretching, right? So stretching is actually proven to improve your range of motion in the short term, but it doesn't have a lot of long-term carryover. So if you want to be more flexible in like maybe the next 20 to 30 minutes, you can improve your tolerance to that painful end range stretch by stretching. Think like, you pinch yourself 10 times and the first one was a surprise, and after a while you're like, oh wait, I'm ready for it. It's okay. I can handle that. Very similar to what a stretch does. You would make your body more tolerant to that uncomfortable feeling at an end range stretch, making your short-term flexibility improved. So you might ask me then, should I still stretch? And I say, maybe, probably not. If you have time, is probably my best answer. If you're checking off all the other boxes, or as I like to say, filling all the other buckets, right? So if you've made sure all your buckets are filled up to the top and you're not overflowing one of your buckets, you can then maybe spend some time stretching. So the biggest bucket to fill is your strength training. It's the number one thing to reduce your injury risk. You need it for performance. Even if you're an endurance athlete, maybe a cyclist, a runner, a swimmer, your endurance is only your ability to repeat the strength that you have over and over again. So if you don't have great strength, your endurance at some point will be limited. Maybe you're a cyclist, you're going up a hill climb. If you don't have particularly great strength and you're not incredibly light, you're going to have a very challenging time expressing your strength repetitively to get up that climb, or maybe need to accelerate to catch up to someone on a sprint. These are very important things for your health and fitness, and they may be significantly more important than your flexibility. Even if you are tight, you might not be great improving your tightness, but you can definitely improve your strength, which may improve your injury risk, which may have been the reason why you were stretching in the first place. Other important buckets to fill would be making sure your endurance and activity tolerance overall is improved. Maybe you're talking about raking leaves. Do you need to stretch your hamstrings so you can improve bending over and raking leaves? Or do you just need to work on your endurance to raking leaves for 10 minutes and then filling the bag, and then another 10 minutes and filling the bag, and an hour later you're shot because your endurance was poor? Then two buckets after that I would say would be mobility and flexibility. If you've checked off your strength and endurance, I would say maybe it's time to start working on those things. They're definitely things that should not be ignored, but are not at the top of your list. So one of the things that does tend to happen is people work on their flexibility a lot, and they can pull their joints in all these different directions, but then they don't have the active mobility to access it and make it useful in daily life, right? So I'll go back to cyclists as an example. You can sit there and maybe you can do something like a prayer stretch where you sit your butt on your heels so your hips can bend up all the way. Or maybe you can lay on your back and you can pull your knee to your chest as hard as you possibly could, and you can definitely get your knee to your chest. But when you actively on the bike try and bring your knee up towards your chest, your stability at the pelvis and hips is not particularly great. So instead of your knee coming up to your chest, your butt rocks on the seat. That's what we would call a deficit in mobility. So your flexibility is clearly there. Mobility, not particularly ideal. We really want that mobility. Like if we had to make it a circle, right? So if the big circle on the outside is your flexibility, we don't want a little circle of mobility, right? We want the mobility ring to be probably very close to the flexibility ring. It would be unreasonable to think that they would be identical, but we want them to be as close as we possibly can. A way to think about your stability would be thinking about a tight spring attached to a loose spring, right? So if this is my tight spring here and it was pulled on a loose spring, the loose spring is going to lengthen out every time and the tight spring is going to stay the same length. We can either improve your mobility by reducing the tight spring and making it a looser spring, or tightening the loose spring. Now, from everything I've explained so far, we tend to be a bit better at improving stability quickly and overall in the long term by strengthening as opposed to loosening. So if we work on tightening that loose spring, our forces tend to even out and we get a better product overall and a better machine that works together, right? Now we're stiff and we can work and this muscle can begin to relax because now they're the same tension of spring and we get a nice even pull across both sides. This is the part of the concept I was speaking about with a cyclist trying to get their knee up to their chest. If their hip is tight, but their back is very loose, you can tighten the low back, which eventually will lead to the hip moving better over time. And by tighten, I mean strengthen the entire trunk region to help stabilize that pelvis on the seat. So one of the ways you might also be able to see this is people bending over and touching their toes. I'm going to try and demonstrate to the best of my abilities. You'll have one person who does not bend from their back at all. Back is entirely flat. I'm here basically touching the floor with an almost entirely flat back. You're going to have a second person who touches the floor by entirely rounding their back. Both people were able to bend down and touch the floor perfectly. If you're just looking from getting from point A to point B, totally fine. You passed the test. Your sit and reach back in elementary school would have passed the presidential fitness test, which would be great, grade A. But if you look at that, if your goal was to improve your hamstring flexibility, you did not improve your hamstring flexibility in the second demonstration that I gave. That was entirely my back bending forward and no hamstrings. Now, I'm unaware of any research that would say that that makes me at a greater risk for injury by bending with my back. But I can say it does mean that my hips are less mobile if that's the strategy that I choose to bend forward. And these are things to consider when you look at your stretching, right? Maybe you're doing something like a sit and reach. If your back is entirely bent during the sit and reach, you're getting more back flexibility than hamstrings flexibility. That would make that stretch not a particularly great one for you to choose to improve that range of motion. So the next question would be, what things should I actually work on? Paul, you've told me what things I shouldn't do and what was a waste of time. What things should I work on? So I want to put together a few examples here and some parameters to abide by with this. So I say stretch if you like it. You like stretching? Please do. I do encourage it. I don't tell people to not stretch. I just encourage you to make sure you don't let that replace the time you could be working on more important things to your health. That's all I ask of people that I try to educate. You want to make sure you work on full range of motion exercise. There's a million options. You can take any exercise that you do and make it full range of motion. I highly encourage to pick a very modest weight, if not just your body weight. And if your body weight's too much at the time, it's got to be a load that you can work through the full range of motion perfectly without a compensation. And the exercise that I'll show you today, I'll explain how we would look for any kind of compensations. It would be a very long lecture if I did that for just about every exercise under the sun. You can also then take a look at active range of motion exercise, focusing on avoiding compensations, if you're noticing a trend here from other body parts, right? So maybe you're working on an active one would be a dead bug. Dead bugs are a very butchered exercise because people are laying on their back and their back might arch and they fully extend their leg and their back begins to arch. Okay, was your hip extending or was your back extending? Or as they raised that arm overhead, same thing happened, right? They raised their arm overhead, their mid back came up, their rib cage came up. It was a compensation from their back, not their shoulder mobility. The other most butchered exercise that I would see is a bird dog, right? Opposite alternating arm and leg extension and shoulder flexion, right? So one's going up, their back caves in, the whole back arches, and they're not really working on mobility. They're working on essentially getting from point A to point B, and whatever happens in the middle was neglected, right? So if you are trying to improve your range of motion, that focus on avoiding the compensations is a pretty big deal for you. So some things before I get into these demonstrations. Being bad at these does not necessarily put you at a risk for injury. And being awesome at these does not necessarily reduce your risk for injury. This advice definitely doesn't substitute for a medical evaluation. And there are also a lot of reasons why you might be good at them or might not be good at them. And that's really tough to answer for maybe like you ask, why am I not good at this? There's probably a number of reasons, and an independent evaluation would be best to answer that because it's tough to just kind of look and see. If you are going to be doing some sort of stretching or mobility exercise, foam rolling or a vibration gun can be very helpful. So I don't tend to lean towards telling people to spend a lot of time foam rolling or using a vibration gun. They don't have a ton of benefit, but one benefit that they do have is short-term increases in range of motion, which if you're then going to follow that up with your mobility work, they can be particularly beneficial and maybe make the effects of that stretching and or mobility work even better. And the last tidbit I would say is consistency and frequent work on your mobility will be significantly better than maximum effort. So if you're doing a hamstring stretch, you'd be better to do it 5 or 10 times a day, very gently working into it, as opposed to yanking on it as hard as you can once a day or once every other day or once a week. That's probably going to have minimal effect on you. You'd be much better off spending a few times a day working on these things at least. So here, I'm going to get into some of the exercises here. I'm going to readjust my laptop so I can hopefully have it, you see what I'm doing. So the first thing I would get into is a hamstring stretch, because that's probably one of the most things that I'm asked about. And the easiest way to do that is take a good old belt. I decided not to pick any fancy equipment here because I want everybody at home to be able to do it. But a belt around the foot and laying on your back. One big sign you know that this is you're either going too far would be that, notice how I get to a certain point my other knee lifts off the ground. If I'm doing that, my pelvis is having to lift up, and that means that I'm going to be going past what my hamstrings can do. I also want to make sure that I leave my knee entirely straight, because the hamstrings attach below my knee and up past my hip. I don't like to get into telling you how long to do it, because there's a lot of research telling you, okay, you could hold this for 10 seconds or 30 seconds or multiple minutes, and all of them have shown to have some level of benefit. So the next follow-up I would say would be the active version of that. So using your quad muscles to see how far you can extend your knee. So you'll have hands behind the knee. You're going to kick as far as you can. And this is something I would repeat. I usually pick around 30 times. It's a relatively arbitrary number, but it's a nice round number that a lot of people pick 3 sets of 10 to do exercises to. If you work on this kicking, you might even notice that if you have that muscle that doesn't like to relax, you might be able to go further as you finish your 30 reps. You didn't magically add sarcomeres in this time, but you did access your mobility a bit better. So last thing for hamstrings that I would pick would be something like a Romanian deadlift or a single leg Romanian deadlift. So for an exercise like this, I'd have a barbell or dumbbells in my hand. You're going to notice that I keep a little bit of a bend in the knees, and I bend down, keeping my back flat until I feel a hamstring stretch, and then I come back up. Similarly, I could stand on one leg and get the same benefits. As soon as you get a bend in the back, a rounding in the back, it's not going to be as biased towards the hamstrings anymore. So I would recommend making sure that you focus on that form. The next thing I would work on is hip flexion, which is how far you can bring your knee up towards your chest. I really like to do this with a lunge. I think it's very beneficial, and it's very good at making sure you're fully capable of moving your body weight through its full range of motion. So from a strength perspective, phenomenal. But also for improving your flexibility, it should help lengthen out those muscles on the back of your legs. So when you're doing a lunge, you can start with just a classic lunge. If you need to make it bias this hip flexion more, you can work on leaning into it a little bit more. If I switch to my right leg here, you're going to notice all hip, not rounding at the back. And as I lean forward, I worked on making sure I stuck my butt out, not making sure that I caved in from my upper back. Great way to work on some strength as well. From there, you could work on a stretch just like for your hamstring, casually pulling your knee to your chest. We don't need to go a ton into that, but similar to the hamstring, you want to make sure that the opposite knee doesn't come off the ground. From there, you can work on standing hip flexion, where maybe you stand up and you make sure you can march up with your knee as high as you possibly can. Notice how when I go higher, I start to round forward and I lose my balance. But when I come up to this point, I'm fighting and I'm not getting any compensations by caving forward in my chest. Lastly, I'm going to go over quadriceps, knee flexion, and hip extension. So one thing you could do stretch-wise is laying on your belly. Take your belt and lasso it around your foot. And then pull up over the top as such. Again, your choice of length and repetitions. You could follow that up with laying on your belly and pulling your knee towards your butt. Now notice, I could go a lot further if I arch my back. If I make sure I keep my back nice and flat by flexing my abs, I can only get to there. And if I try and go further, I'm pretty sure my hamstrings would cramp, which I would like to avoid doing on camera. A really good way to also improve that quadricep and hip extension is to do what we would call a reverse Nordic. So we're up in this position, and you work to fall back as much as you can, and then bring it forward. Great way to work on how these muscles have to lengthen while they're under tension, as well as really improve that strength in the region. So I know that there are a lot of other muscles in the body that we could address, and joints and movements, but I'm going to limit it to some of the hip things today, just for sake of time and for simplicity, considering the hips are something that most people find they need to work on a little bit of mobility with. From here, I really like to open the live chat to any questions that anybody has. And if you'd like to reach out, please type, and hopefully I have some time to answer your questions. I'm going to give everybody about 5 minutes. I might step off the camera for a quick second, and then we can go from there. If anything pops up, I'll begin to answer. Hey, Mike, thanks for reaching out with that. Uh, for patellar tendon issues, I probably would not have a patient be leaning or kneeling at this point in time. You can definitely try doing it on a pillow and see if that helps you out. It may be a bit much for a patellar tendon issue because one of the issues with if it is patellar tendonitis or any kind of tendinopathy, if you are lengthening it under load, that's something we'd want to do later down the rehab stages. But early on, that might be a bit provocative. If it's not a tendonitis problem and it just hurts in that region, I would just do it on a pillow, which is great. I'm lucky that my knees feel good at this stage in my life, so I can kneel pretty well. But that's not everybody's case. So Alexandra, I have really tight glutes. What can I do for that? So you would really benefit from the lunges that I spoke of and really working up deep into that range of motion. Maybe you even consider as you would progress your lunges doing them in place rather than a walking lunge. And you could do them on maybe a step or maybe a mini step and progress to a bigger step, or maybe even one of the steps in your home. You can work on how deep you work into that lunge before you have some kind of compensation from your back. One thing I'm not suspicious of, but would consider with someone who has tight glutes is their low back and lower abdominal strength. So if you can improve that trunk strength, I guarantee that your tight glutes will loosen up at least in one way, shape, or form. It might help the way you move at a minimum. But the series on the knee to chest, the lunges, even if you hop on all fours and you work on rocking back, if I can give a little demonstration here, something to the tune of this. Now you can notice that as I did that, my back is perfectly straight as opposed to rounding right away, right? Making sure we work right into the hips, and that should help a little bit of the glute tightness. You could always get into something like a pigeon stretch where you're through here, which can help that a little bit. But I find that turns into the improving a lot of flexibility, but not necessarily improving a ton of mobility. It's pretty hard to progress pigeon. You could, but it gets to some high level stuff that I don't think we can touch on today. But definitely things you could think into. Thanks for the questions, guys. That's awesome. I'm going to be patient and stick around for a few minutes. In prior videos, I only waited a minute or two, and for some reason, my comments didn't come in. So bear with me for a second. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. All right. Well, I'm going to sign off for the night. Unless I'm missing anything, get your comments and questions in real quick. But thank you to everybody who tuned in. If you ever need anything from me, please feel to reach out. We have resources on our website at summitpt-nj.com. My email is my name, PAULCOVIELLODPT @gmail.com. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions from me. I'm also on Facebook. I'm be more than happy to be friends. And I hope you all get flexible, mobile, and ask me any questions you ever need. So I hope you have a great rest of your night. Be good, everybody.